Hello everyone. As many of you may know, Voiceover Pete has gotten to a midlife crisis, and he needs our support to boost him to the top. Now, what I'm going to do for my part is I'm going to say Voiceover Pete 10,000 times in support of Voiceover Pete. So, I have my water, I have my root beer, I got my janky set up here, and then I also have the time and counter right here. So that you know I'm not cheating or anything. So, let's start. Voiceover Pete. There's first one. That's it. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Pete, Voiceover 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 Pete. It's really it gets difficult after you say something a lot of times. It becomes more difficult to say for some reason. Like try saying toy boat like 10 times fast. It's kind of like that, except Voiceover Pete. That counts. All right. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. We are at 100, 1/100th of the way. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I misclicked. I think I had an extra one. Voiceover Pete. There we go. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voice over Pete, Voiceover 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 Pete. I think I misclicked one, so I'm gonna add another one. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. That's 200 times that I've said Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. So that's about 1/50th of the way. Right? Yeah. Yeah, because it's one of... I don't know. Voiceover Pete. 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 I keep wanting to say like vor, like cause you want to like say it faster, but it doesn't work. It's just Voiceover Pete. 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 Maine is the closest state to Africa. Like that's amazing. Voiceover Pete. 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 I'm not sure if that was one. I don't think it was. I right clicked. Voiceover Pete. 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 I think I double clicked by accident. Voiceover Pete. There we go. I'm not a cheater. You like that Rick in the background? He's just watching. Between you and I'm scared of Rick. I am very scared of Rick. Voiceover Pete. 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 322. Voiceover Pete. 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 Voice. That counts. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. I already want to die. Voiceover Pete. 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 Wait. Good. Voiceover Pete. I missed. That counts as 3 anyway. Also, for those of you that say I'm a copy of Mr. Beast, you're right. I'm sorry. Stealing his content. Voiceover Pete, 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 voice over 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 Pete. I'm like forgetting how to say voice over Pete. It's like with the whole PewDiePie one. It's like it's a lot easier because it's just PewDiePie, you know, so easy. Those count. Actually, no, they don't. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. There we go. Yeah, I already want to die, so that's good. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete. Mike probably didn't pick that up. Voice over Pete. Alright, there we go. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. It is now midnight. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. You didn't hear that. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. I forgot. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice. I'm recharged. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. If I say voice, I'm not gonna correct it anymore. It's just too difficult. Like, you try to say voice over Pete 10,000 times, like it's gonna happen to you too, unless you do it really slowly. But I don't want to sit here for 3 years. I'm gonna try and get this done as fast as I can. So, I'm gonna say voice over Pete. Didn't I say like voice over Pete like 3 times during that? And then that time was a 4th. Alright, anyway. I think it was 2 times. Voice over Pete. There we go. So 500. That's 1/20th of the way. We're already zooming through. We just got to do what I just did 20 more times, and then we're good to go. So, voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. I want to look at the camera more, you know, my shitty grainy camera, but like, it's it's hard because sometimes I'll misclick. That was a long pause. I hated that. Anyway, sometimes I'll misclick, and then if I'm not looking, then I won't notice. And then I can just keep misclicking, and I would say Voiceover Pete a lot of times, and then they just wouldn't count because I'm not paying attention. So I'm gonna try my best to look over here, but I'm gonna fix my hair over here. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Make sure I'm recording. Good. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. If you haven't noticed, I kind of started saying it differently. I'm saying like Voiceover Pete, not like Voiceover Pete, but like Voiceover Pete. It's because it's a lot easier. Also, I said it like 3 times, I think. Voiceover Pete. There, that makes it up if I only said 2, because I'm not actually that sure. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Okay, mouse pad. It's because it's like up against my monitor stand, so it's at a weird angle. Let me move my monitor a bit. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. That counts as 2. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I think I forgot to click once. Voice, voice, voice. Over, over, over. Pete, Pete, Pete. That might be the trick. I'm not gonna do that though, because that's stupid. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. My jaws hurt. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Kangaroos can't jump unless their tails are touching the ground. Isn't that interesting? Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I missed. I know that one for sure. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. What a legend. I wonder if you'd give me a, like a, I'm trying to think of what it's called. Like a free message, if you'd say something for me, just for this video. Voiceover Pete, contact me. And Mr. Beast, give me some money. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I'm pretty sure I said Voiceover Pete when I was talking about Voiceover Pete. So that's one, and then the 2 times that I just said it. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I like this at the casino. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 800. It is 12:10 a.m. I have a lot of time to go. Woohoo! Cheers. I had a really big mug. Like, it's as tall as my head. I figured I'd probably need it for this. So I got a big mug, and then I also got my root beer. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Attention, all YouTube viewers. Sanguine is in dire need of your help. He's trying to count, well, not count, but he's trying to say Voiceover Pete 10,000 times and needs your help. All he needs is probably turn on Do Not Disturb. I'm saying Voiceover Pete 10,000 times. Alright. Let's get these back up. Do Not Disturb is on now. Probably should have done that before I started this, but I didn't think of it. Alright. Also, I read out loud Voiceover Pete when I was typing, so there's one. And then the Voiceover Pete that I just said. And then the Voiceover Pete that I just said just now, too. Oh, and the Voiceover Pete that I just said. And that one. Alright, Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Pete, Voiceover 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 Pete. Alright, it's a bit late. Other side. I'm on the nice list this year. It's December 30th as I'm making this. So yeah, it's a bit late, but I don't care. Go hate somewhere else. I'm counting to Voiceover Pete. That doesn't make any sense. I'm saying Voiceover Pete 10,000 times. That's a lot of Voiceover Petes. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover. God, why is it keep double clicking on accident? Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I have now said Voiceover Pete 1,000 times. That's 1/10 of the way. Just got to get to 10,000. That extra 0. Even though I just drew like 7 zeros. Voiceover Pete. My mouth is dry. Also, if you're seeing this, subscribe. Even though I know you're not. Nobody's saying this ever. Subscribe to PewDiePie. Why did I just say subscribe to PewDiePie? I meant to say Voiceover Pete. There. What if I become Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I just said one Voiceover Pete for every pixel across my monitor. That's right, 1080p gang. Who cares about higher resolutions? I'm all about that higher refresh rate. Mine's only 60. I'm broke. Send money my way, and maybe I can get a new monitor. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. 1,111. Wow. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. 1157. Shout out to Danny Mernon, Ethan Brazel, and Kyle Whitlow. Oh, and Beirut. I don't know what your last name is, sorry. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Also, I said across my monitor. I mean like up and down, not across. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I kinda regret this, but only kinda. I'm gonna stay strong. Go the whole way. Subscribe to PewDiePie. Why? Why? I never said subscribe to PewDiePie like 10,000 times. Why am I saying that? Why? I guess I like associate Voiceover Pete. It counts as one of them. Voiceover Pete. There we go. I guess I kind of associate the two together, so I'm saying subscribe to PewDiePie instead of Voiceover Pete. I don't know. I guess I'm getting confused. Anyway, Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I think I double clicked by accident, so Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 subscribe to me. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. 1431. Oh, jeez. I screwed that up. Alright. Also, when you're doing some of these, it's imperative that you say random things throughout, like I am right now, so they know it's not a loop. And then you occasionally say the number, like right now it's 1431. And then make sure your video never cuts, because if it cuts, then you're for sure cheating. Like, for sure cheating. No benefit of the doubt. You're cheating. Cheater. Get out of here. Click off the video. Cheater. Cheater. Rick is disappointed. You can't even see Rick anymore. There we go. Yeah, good enough. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. What I hate is that Voiceover Pete is 4 syllables. So I'm saying 40,000 syllables. I could just say 40,000 of a 1-syllable word, and that would seem like much better. Cause it's more times. But really, if someone said sanguine like 20,000 times, then that's just as good as me saying Voiceover Pete 10,000 times, because both are just 40,000 syllables. Yeah. I get one just for saying sanguine. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 slay the natives. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 1515. Burger? No. I'm not about that. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. If you didn't understand, that's a dead meme. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I don't know what it is about this mouse, but like, I double click on accident sometimes. It's quite gets on my nerves. Cause then like I think I have more than I actually do, but then I realize that I just have to say Voiceover Pete again. And Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Shout out to Coffee playing Borderlands 2. Good for you. Thanks for interrupting. I don't shit care. I love you, Coffee. No homo though. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete! Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. 1655. Ugh. PewDiePie 100,000 times. Like, I get that it's easier saying PewDiePie, but, like, still. I already have a headache. I think that's just from being dropped on the head, though. I wasn't actually, please, no, make fun. PewDiePie, PewDiePie. Every time. This time it's just PewDiePie, and I think it's because I was talking about Mr. Beast counting PewDiePie. But, like, still, why? This is for Voiceover Pete. This is for Voiceover Pete. See what I did there? Made up for it. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Keepstar. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Shouldn't have started this late. I don't know why I did. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. See, saying like PewDiePie, that doesn't require much. It just requires lip movement. PewDiePie, PewDiePie, PewDiePie. But when you say Voiceover Pete, you gotta do all this jaw movement, and it hurts. I think that's what's giving me the headache, cause like, yeah, cause like right here, like when I move my jaw a lot, it like hurt. It's hard to explain, but I hate it. Just say Voiceover Pete 1730. That I shouldn't have said it like that. 1,737 times, and you'll understand. This is terrible. That's why I'm only saying it 10,000 times. I may not be as good as Mr. Beast, but I am. I'm just as good as Mr. Beast. None of you heard that. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. You know what's funny? I say that I'm doing this to help Voiceover Pete, but like, nobody's gonna see this. So, I wanna die. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. This is the passcode in my phone. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Repeat, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Subscribe to Voiceover Pete. No, it's 2, because I actually told you to subscribe. Because right now I'm not saying subscribe to Voiceover Pete. I'm just saying Voiceover Pete. So I think the subscribe to Voiceover Pete should count as 2. Except only the first one. Because otherwise I can just keep saying subscribe to Voiceover Pete, subscribe to Voiceover Pete, and that's 2 each. Which I think is stupid. I did 2 because I just said it twice. Not because I said subscribe to Voiceover Pete. You get it though. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Boom Boom, Voiceover Pete, 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 boom boom again, Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 missed that one. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 2,000! 1/5 of the way. I can't believe I just said Voiceover Pete 2,000 times. Only 8,000 to go. Send food, help in money. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 2003, the year I was born. Voiceover Pete, 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 Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. The year, but not for long. Only for like 2 more days. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I don't know if that one worked. It's like kind of like a half click. I'm just gonna assume it did. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voice over 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 Pete. Oh dear God! Gotta get that Rick in there. For though, when's season 4 coming? Like, it's kind of annoying, because, like, it's such a good show. But then, like, at the end of the season, they're just like, alright, see you in a few years. Bye. Ugh. So, yeah. It's kind of annoying, but masterpiece. It's quantity or quality. Quantity is the Soviet Union way. Everywhere else uses quality. So that's why I forgot what I was saying. Voiceover Pete. Oh yeah, that's why they're taking so much time, because they want to make it so good. They're not taking a break or anything. Voiceover Pete, 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 Over Pete, Voiceover 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 Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Notice that my V's kind of weren't working there, so I need to hydrate over. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 2222. Yes. Alright, shout out to everyone on my AP government table. Got Isaac, Caleb, Ildar, and Lostog. That's right, I called you Lostog. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover voiceover Pete, 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 ever over Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 2, 3, 4, 5. Cool. Also, not sponsored, but like, I mean, all right. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Shout out to Mr. Dorsey. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Hey, we just hit an hour. Wow, I can't believe I've been doing this for an hour. I have a terrible life where I sit here saying Voiceover Pete for an hour. And as it seems, 3 more hours to go. So, let's hop in. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Just myself, cause it kind of hurts, you know. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. That was 2 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. 2,500. That's 1/4 of the way. Shout out to Devin, even though I don't like you for what you did. You know what you did. Who else can I shout out? That's it. Oh, and shout out to Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Rip in the chat for Steven Hillenberg, still crying. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Dislike YouTube Rewind. Like the good good YouTube Rewind. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 PewDiePie, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Life review. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, 0 out of 10. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I really hope my mic's picking that up. I started talking really quiet there. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I think I double tapped there. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Ugh. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Pete. That counts. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I'm not sure if I counted that one. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I'm gonna cheat because you guys aren't gonna see this anyway. You're just gonna skip to the end or random parts, but you're not gonna see this one. Ha. Voiceover Pete. I'm just kidding. I would never do that to our Lord and Savior, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. La 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 Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I want to kill myself. I'm joking. Calm down. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. You didn't hear that. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. I've said voiceover Pete 3,000 times. That's a lot of times, guys. Wow. I'm actually impressed with myself at this point. Voiceover Pete, 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 Marie, voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. My back. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Minor interruption. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. I just had to sketch my arm. Allergies getting to me. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. First one to comment 3153 is a true gamer. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, you need to make your name easier to say. Just to make my life easier, you know? Because it really be like that right now. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. What's that single? I think so. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Rick looks beautiful up there. He looks like he's proud of me. I just want to go to sleep. But too bad. I have to help Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. 3, 3, 3, 3. Ow, it kind of hurt. My middle finger. Well, okay. I'm filming this on my iPhone, by the way, because my camera, like, I got it out of the freaking basement, because it's been a while since I've used it. And the camera, no, not the camera, the battery was out. And I can't film this tomorrow. That's why I'm doing it late at night now. Because tomorrow, we're setting up for... Honestly, I don't even know what we're doing tomorrow. We're doing something tomorrow. I'm assuming it has to do with New Year's. But I don't know. Alright. What am I supposed to say again? Oh yeah, Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. That was two. Voiceover Pete. There we go. I'm not a cheater. I'm a real gamer. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Wow. That's amazing. I am at 3, 4, 5, 6. 3, 4, 5, 6. That's amazing. Alright. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Forgot to count those. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I forgot to count one. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Wow. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover over Pete, voiceover Pete, voice over Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. I don't know. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. No, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Yeah, I dabbed, but it doesn't matter because nobody's gonna see this. God, I'm such a Mr. Beast ripoff. But I don't care. So whatever. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. I said it twice. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Alright, I'm so glad I get to keep doing this. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover again, Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Coffee is interrupting the video again, playing. I think it was CS:GO. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. But shout out to Coffee again. Oh yeah. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Alright. Oh. I just need a breather. Oh. Alright, anyway. So that's 4,000. Good. Sorry, I'm trying to do something. Alright, so that's 4,000. Also, shout out to Levi Banks. What a legend. Let's go messaging, by the way. Alright. So we're at 4,000. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh, I missed a couple. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Alright, hold on 1 second. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I think I just double clicked right there. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover this one. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voice repeat, 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 T series, voice repeat, 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 voice over Pete. Ah. I'm so close to 5,000. Alright. Oh yeah. I swear, I blink out like every time. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. 4,300. Wow. Shout out to Ilbron and Angel Harbor. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Wow. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. I'm gonna make sure I'm still recording, that'd be terrible. Coffee, thanks for interrupting the video again. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 4, 4, 4, 4. We're almost there. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Heat, Heat Pete, Voiceover Pete, Pete, that counts, whatever. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I am so hungry. I could go for some food. Sounds great. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Yeah, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Shout out to Donald Trump. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Can't wait to get carpal tunnel syndrome. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Pete, Voiceover Pete, Pete. I need water. I think that's what it is. I need water. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 the Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Need like a little massage. Also, I lost my wallet. If any of you have seen my wallet, let me know. Gotta make sure Rick is in there. Actually, you know what? Rick, you'll be fine. Not in it. No, never mind. You're in it. I'm tired. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. I missed. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Yeah. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Grande is better than dull and dark. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. It looks like Windows 7, doesn't it? But it's actually Windows 10. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh, 5,000. I'm halfway there. Oh my god. Oh. Gosh. Shout out to Cameron, Kayla, Gabe, Reed, Jaden, and the rest. Too many. Alright, well, I'm gonna take a small break. I'm gonna grab like a small snack, eat it real quick, and then I'm gonna get started again. So, okay, I have taken my mid-session break, ate some Cheerios, drank a little bit of water, but I can just do that anyway. Alright, so we're basically just starting over again, doing what we just did again, and then we'll be done. So, that's what we'll be doing for the next 2 hours. Woohoo! Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. All right. So I just did one set of 100. I have to do 50 more of those total, but I just did one, so 49 of what I just did. Alright. Also, DPI scaling. Gabe, get mad at me. Alright. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice over Pete. 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 I'm gonna lose a Santa hat. Ugh. It's not Christmas anymore. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. 48 to go. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over... Alright, voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. It is about to be 2 a.m. I'm just gonna watch this happen. Boom! Alright, 2 a.m. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete. Voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Cool. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. I can do the default dance with my fingers. Bow, 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 bow. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Subscribe to Voice over Pete. That's 2. Oh wait, I already did that meme. Never mind. Voice over Pete. There we go. Voice over Pete. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Alright. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. Voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, where voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, voice over repeat, voice over repeat. You know, something that I'm realizing now is that there's a lot more Easter eggs toward the beginning of the video and not really towards the end. It's because, like, I had some ideas and I did them, and then now, like, I don't have any more ideas except for talking about the ideas, like I am now, except for that. Oh yeah. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Wow, something weird was going on with the audio right there. Alright. Voice over Pete. 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 Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete. I don't think that worked. Or it might have. I don't know. Either way, don't care, I'm tired. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Oh, I think I've missed a couple. I don't know how many though. Voice of repeat, 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 voice ever, over. Pete, voice of repeat, 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 Pete, voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of ever. I keep saying ever. Order. Over. Pete. There. I dragged a little bit, so it didn't work in time. But here, I'll do it this time. Voiceover Pete. No way. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. There we go. And then the 2 other times I said it. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat. I'm gonna try that again. Voice of voice over repeat. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voiceover Pete. 6,000. Can't believe that I said Voiceover Pete. How many times? 6,000 times. Alright. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Readjust. Yeah. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Sorry for the really bad audio quality, by the way, and video quality. Oh yeah, voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. 6130, the passcode to my phone. Just kidding, it's not it. I'm just taking a few second break right here. Okay. Alright. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. If you pour the milk in before the cereal, then I will find you. I'll actually find you. No, I won't kill you. I'll teach you how to be right. Cause like, just think about it. It's like putting, like, okay, so say you have ice cream and you want to put chocolate syrup on top. Do you put in the chocolate syrup first? No, you put. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to say Voiceover Pete again after this. Voiceover Pete. I missed. Voiceover Pete. 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 Missed. Think that much. Voiceover Pete. 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 Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Yep. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete 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 voice. Voiceover Pete 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 Pete. That counts as like 10. That was amazing. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Voice over repeat, 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 voice over repeat. Gonna make sure I'm still recording. Alright, good. Because again, I would hate to it not be. That'd suck, wouldn't it? Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Did it click? I think so. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice over repeat. 6,500. That's a lot. Rick, what do you think? Yeah. He didn't say anything. It's just I don't have friends. So Rick he's the closest thing I got to a friend. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. How's Super Smash Bros. Ultimate? I haven't played it yet. I heard it's really good. And that it's the most ambitious crossover event in history. I've heard that too. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. 6, 6, 6, 6. Oh. See, around right now, that's around like right now, this is the highest point of regret. That just makes me wish I hadn't even have started this, but you know, it's for Voiceover Pete, so I have to. I don't like how my face is in the shot. I'm gonna try and what? Better. Okay. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice for Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. I'm so tired. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Alright, minor interruption, but we are back. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Attention all voice over Pete's. Voice over Pete needs your voice over Pete. Voice over Pete and voice over Pete, your voice over Pete today. So voice over Pete can voice over Pete the voice over Pete that voice over Pete gave to voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. And the three numbers in the back. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Unsubscribe from Shane Dawson. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, voice over Pete, voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Never do this. Never. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Even though it doesn't matter because none of you are going to see this. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. The little energy I have left, I can't believe I should use it on that. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. 7,000. Wow. 3,000 left to go. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. God, it barely sounds like Voiceover Pete. Was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat. Was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat. Was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat, was repeat. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. 7,100. This, yeah, I'm feeling it now. I'm feeling it now. Literally no idea what I just did. Alright. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Was a repeat, was a repeat, was a repeat, was repeat. Again, was repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat, voice of repeat. Whoops. Voice of repeat, voice of repeat. Rick, what do you think? Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. 7,200. Wow. Was repeat, 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 was repeat. Voice 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 repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Gotta get over that. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat. Oh, I missed a bunch. I'm just gonna think that's it. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Jeez. Hey, we hit 3 hours. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Fix my hair. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice over repeat. Voice repeat. Voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, voice oh, I miss. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I think I missed one. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. 3/4 of the way, 7,500. I am so very tired. My head hurts too. I like to go to sleep. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Repeat. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Did you know that Dr. Doofenshmirtz's parents, neither of them showed up for his birth? Like, that's pretty sad. I feel bad for Dr. Doofenshmirtz. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh, I think I missed a bunch. Yeah. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh, jeez. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Oh. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice over Pete, 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 voice over Pete. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Yay, 2200 left. Voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat, voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. Voice repeat, 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 voice repeat. My arms got like, you probably can't see it, but my arm has like little marks. just from the edge here. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover. Oh, I think that's a good number. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice of repeat. Voice of repeat, 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 voice over repeat. 8,000. I'm so tired. Is this what hell is? If so, I need to cleanse myself. Alright, well, 2,000 left to go. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I thought I skipped some, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Oh, I missed some. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I might just pass out. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Oh, here's a mess. Alright. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. I'm going a lot slower now, but I'm still chipping away at the big number. 1,600 left to go. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 yeah, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. I think I did a double one a couple times ago, so Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover. Oh god, I like mini slept just there. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Faces. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete to tap, which is kind of not fair, but Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Oh my god. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 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 Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Yo. Voiceover Pete. 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 9,000 voiceover Pete's. Over 9,000. Oh, I'm so tired. It is currently 3:31 a.m. 3:32 a.m. Alright. Well, this is a home stretch. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. It really does not sound like voiceover Pete. But when you get tired, and I've already said it 9,000 times, it just happens. It's uncontrollable. It's not like I'm choosing to do it to go faster. Like, I actually cannot. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Also, I like how when people over-exaggerate, they're like, oh my gosh, I said it like 9,000 times. But now for this, I can say, I actually said it 9,000 times. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. That one was good. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I had an itchy head right there. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 800 left to go. Oh, I clicked on accident. Voiceover Pete. Alright, there we go. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Why? Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. You want some muffin? Please, I just want to die. I agree with the last part. What about you, Rick? God, I've made that stupid joke that's not even funny too many times. It wasn't even funny to begin with, but now it's even less funny than it already isn't. Alright. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Oh, I'm clicking way off somehow. I'm just gonna click those Pete's up. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Yeah, I picked my mouse up so I can't accidentally move it. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 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 500 left. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Shane Dawson. Voiceover Pete. 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 Voiceover Pete, 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 whoops, Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. Hey, we hit 4 hours. Woohoo! Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. I need water. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. A shout out to Gary Gerardo. What a legend. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. 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 Oh, voiceover Pete. 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 Pete. Voiceover 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 over P. Oh. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete, voiceover Pete. Last 100, final stretch. Voiceover Pete, 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 voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. It gets a lot harder to remember what I have to say, especially since it's 4 in the morning, and I've been doing this for 4 hours. Oh. Voiceover Pete, 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 Voiceover Pete. This is it. Voiceover Pete. I did it. Oh my god. Oh my god, I did it. I said Voiceover Pete 10,000 times in one sitting. It took a bit longer than I expected, if I'm being honest. Because it's a lot harder to say than something like PewDiePie, 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 PewDiePie. Because, like, in this, you have to say Voiceover Pete, Voiceover Pete. Oh, man. Alright, well, if Voiceover Pete sees this, hit me up. Alright, well, that's it. Ladies and gents, you have a great night.